The wind coming off Lake Ontario carried a sharp December bite in 1941, the kind that made the shoreline feel barren and forgotten. In the darkness, only a handful of silhouettes moved quietly across the frozen mud. A pair of lanterns glowed faintly near a cluster of unmarked buildings, their outlines almost absorbed by the night. There were no signs, no flags, no insignia. To any passerby, the place looked like nothing more than an abandoned farm. Yet behind those walls, the most secretive institution in Canada was being born. The British called it Special Training School No. 103. The Canadians called it the Oshawa Project. To the Americans, it would soon become a bridge to an intelligence world they barely knew existed. But to those who lived and worked inside its fences, it was known by a name spoken only behind closed doors. Camp X. Officially, it was not supposed to exist. There were no public documents, no official announcement, not even a hint in government communications. The land had been secured quietly, purchased under the direction of Sir William Stephenson, a Canadian industrialist turned spy master, who was already deep inside Churchill's clandestine intelligence operations. Stephenson, known in code as Intrepid, understood better than most that the war could not be won by force alone. Information, deception, and sabotage would determine victory just as much as tanks and aircraft. The first time Stephenson visited the shoreline site, the ground was still soft and wet from autumn rain. He stood beside the water, hands in his coat pockets, assessing the space with a steady, calculating gaze. The area was isolated enough to guarantee secrecy, but close enough to major rail lines to move trainees invisibly. The lake offered a direct route to the Atlantic, and the open fields provided room for training ranges, weapons testing, and explosives demonstrations. It was the perfect place to create something the Axis powers would never see coming. Across the ocean, Britain was fighting for survival. German U-boats choked the Atlantic. London had endured nearly a year of bombing. The Wehrmacht's advance in Europe showed no sign of slowing. Churchill needed allies, but he also needed an army of shadow operatives capable of slipping behind enemy lines. Canada, positioned far from enemy aircraft and infiltration, became the ideal country to build such an army. It was safe, loyal, and geographically vital. Construction began fast and without ceremony. Workers arrived with blank paperwork and orders not to ask questions. The buildings went up one and after another. Barracks, classrooms, a communications center disguised as a maintenance shed, a firing range tucked into a hollow in the trees. Only a few men understood the facility's purpose, and those men spoke sparingly and never in public. When the first instructors arrived, they came with British accents, stiff postures, and strange resumes. Some were officers from the Special Operations Executive. Others were veterans of colonial intelligence campaigns. A few had been police inspectors or linguists. They were the kind of men who knew how to make a story disappear and how to teach others to do the same. On a cold morning just before Christmas, 1941, the first batch of trainees stepped off a transport truck at the gate. They wore civilian clothes and carried no identification. Many had been hand-picked from the British Commonwealth, while others were European refugees hoping to strike back at the regimes that had destroyed their homes. Some were American volunteers operating quietly despite the United States only recently entering the war. Every man who walked through the gates understood one thing. Nothing they learned inside Camp X could ever be acknowledged publicly. One Canadian officer, assigned to escort the group from Montreal, watched their expressions as they approached the main building. It was painted a pale, worn color, the sort of building that looked purposely unimpressive. The officer spoke to them in a low voice. No nicknames. No unnecessary chatter. No diaries, photographs, or letters. Once inside, they would be stripped of anything that connected them to their old lives. A few men exchanged uneasy glances. Others stared straight ahead as though they had already accepted the cost. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, designed intentionally to prevent trainees from overhearing conversations or recognizing faces. Instructors stepped out from doorways with the precision of men accustomed to watching every movement. Their voices were direct, almost cold. They explained the rules, the schedules, the exercises. Nothing about the program was gentle. Camp X was not a place for heroics. It was a place for precision, discipline, and silence. In the early days, Stephenson visited often, arriving unannounced and staying only long enough to evaluate progress. He spoke with instructors quietly, reviewing reports that detailed the psychological profiles of each trainee. His focus was not on creating commandos. His mission was to shape agents who could operate invisibly in hostile territory. Men who could survive without support, blend into foreign cities, and dismantle enemy operations without ever being seen. He insisted on one detail above all others. Every agent trained at Camp X needed to be capable of disappearing at a moment's notice. No loose ends, no traces. Their work had to leave nothing but questions behind. Word of the camp spread only through rumor. In nearby towns, fishermen noticed increased military patrols along the shoreline. Locals sometimes heard bursts of gunfire echoing through the trees, or saw smoke drifting from areas normally occupied by grazing cattle. Yet when anyone asked, the answers were rehearsed. It's a radio facility, a training site for engineers, a government storage yard, anything but the truth. One evening, a farmer living several miles to the west watched strange lights moving across the lake. At first he thought they were searchlights. Then he realized they were handheld lanterns carried by men walking across the icy shoreline near the camp. They moved with purpose and formation, as though practicing something too organized to be casual. The farmer told a neighbor the next morning. The neighbor shook his head and said it was best not to pay attention. Inside the camp, secrecy became part of daily life. Meals were eaten in silence. Trainees slept in narrow bunks with their boots beside them in case alarms sounded. Instructors often woke them before dawn, forcing them into drills that tested endurance and obedience. Some men thrived, others cracked. Those who faltered were quietly removed from the program, taken off the grounds before sunrise, and sent away without explanation. In late winter, a young American soldier named Thomas Crane arrived. He had been recruited after showing exceptional skills in navigation and marksmanship. When he stepped into the main training hall, he immediately noticed the atmosphere. There was no decoration, no motivational posters, just plain wooden walls, a row of chairs, and a map of Europe covered in small red pins. An instructor approached him with an expression that revealed nothing. The man extended a file folder and asked Crane to memorize every detail inside before midnight. Crane opened it. The first page contained a new identity, a new birthplace, a new history. His real name appeared nowhere. The birth of Camp X was more than a Canadian contribution to the war. It was the foundation of modern clandestine operations. It was a place where men learned not just how to fight, but how to vanish. Where radios hummed with encrypted messages meant to travel thousands of miles. Where every lesson carried the understanding that failure meant death and success meant anonymity. By early 1942, the camp was fully operational. Hundreds of trainees had already passed through its gates, each preparing for missions they could never speak of publicly. The outside world continued unaware, and even within the government, only a handful of officials understood the camp's true purpose. On one particularly cold night, Stephenson stood once more at the shoreline, watching the wind churn the lake's dark water. Behind him, the camp buzzed with activity. Instructors drilled recruits on sabotage techniques. Communications officers worked quietly in the Hydra building, monitoring coded transmissions. The shadow war was growing, and Camp X was now one of its beating hearts. The camp's existence remained hidden, protected by layers of secrecy so dense that even decades later, many of its operations would remain classified. Yet the men who trained there would soon carry its lessons into the most dangerous corners of the conflict, shaping the outcomes of missions that could never be acknowledged. As Stephenson turned back toward the camp lights, the first trainees prepared to graduate. Their bags were packed, their new identities memorized, their expectations unspoken. The silence of the night felt heavier than before, filled with the knowledge that what happened next would push them far beyond those muddy fields in Ontario. Camp X had begun its work, and the war in the shadows was waiting. The mornings at Camp X began before the sun touched Lake Ontario. In the cold blue hour just before dawn, the camp whistle cut through the quiet. Trainees rose without hesitation, pulling on boots still damp from the previous day's exercises. They moved quickly, because any delay meant scrutiny, and scrutiny often meant being sent home. A man dismissed from Camp X was not simply rejected. He was considered unreliable, unfit for the shadow war that demanded absolute control of one's mind and body. The first drill of the day started on the frozen ground behind the main barracks. The trainees lined up as instructors paced silently before them. Major William Fairbairn, one of the most respected close combat experts of the era, often led the morning sessions himself during the camp's early months. He was a compact man with a rigid posture and expressionless eyes. His voice carried a tone that offered no room for argument. Fairbairn did not teach elegance or ceremony. He taught survival. His combat methods had been formed in the streets of Shanghai, where the difference between living and dying was measured in seconds. As the trainees circled one another in pairs, Fairbairn demonstrated throws, strikes, and disabling techniques that ignored traditional rules of engagement. He reminded them that their missions would not resemble conventional warfare. Their actions would unfold in alleyways, cellars, fields, and crowded cities where hesitation meant death. A British trainee named Henry Mercer felt the full weight of the training in his ribs one icy morning when Fairbairn corrected his stance with a sudden sweeping strike. Mercer hit the ground before he understood what had happened. When he looked up, the instructor simply repeated the movement, slower this time, and told him to rise. Mercer pushed himself to his feet, wincing. Pain was as common as sweat in the routines of Camp X. After close combat training came physical conditioning. Some days it meant running miles across uneven terrain. Other days it meant carrying heavy equipment or climbing ropes while instructors shouted corrections. But physical strength was only a small part of what Camp X demanded. The real transformations occurred inside the classrooms and wooded clearings where the psychological elements of espionage were taught. One of the most enigmatic instructors at Camp X was a quiet man known to the trainees only as Harrison. His background was never discussed, but those who met him believed he had spent years in Europe undercover. His lessons involved how to enter a room without drawing attention, how to judge a stranger's intentions by observing small gestures, how to shift one's posture to resemble a local in a foreign city. Harrison emphasized that invisibility was not the absence of presence. It was the art of blending so completely into a setting that no one remembered your face afterward. He often brought the trainees into Oshawa or Whitby, disguised as factory workers or farmhands. Their assignment was simple but brutally difficult. Navigate the streets without being noticed, pick up specific observations, and return to camp with accurate details. If even one local resident identified them as unusual, the exercise was considered a failure. Harrison reviewed their results in a dimly lit classroom, his quiet voice cutting through their excuses. He explained that a single moment of suspicion could unravel an entire operation. The camp's most closely guarded facility stood near the edge of the property. The Hydra building, outwardly unremarkable, housed a sophisticated communications center run by Canadian technicians and British code specialists. Its radio towers, hidden within ordinary-looking structures, connected Camp X directly to London and Washington. Inside, operators transmitted encoded messages at speeds the Axis powers struggled to match, using a system so advanced that the Germans never fully deciphered it. Trainees assigned to communications duty entered Hydra with a mix of intimidation and awe. They were taught how to handle encryption machines, how to intercept enemy transmissions, and how to hide a radio set in plain sight. A young Norwegian recruit named Anders Jensen remembers the first time he saw the main communication board. Its glowing dials and humming wires seemed like something from a laboratory, yet every signal carried life or death information. Hydra was the heartbeat of the North American intelligence network, and its operators understood the responsibility resting on their shoulders. Outside, the wooded training grounds hosted the camp's more volatile lessons. Explosives experts arrived from Britain to teach sabotage, one of the most essential skills for agents destined for occupied Europe. They demonstrated how to derail trains, disable power stations, break supply lines, and destroy enemy equipment with minimal materials. Trainees learned how to construct charges using household items, how to place detonators without leaving fingerprints, and how to measure fuse lengths with nothing more than instinct and experience. A Czech trainee named Pavel Kolar excelled in these sessions. He had fled Europe after losing family members to the occupation and carried a quiet determination that fueled his focus. One afternoon, after placing a charge inside a mock engine block, he stepped back and watched as the device ignited with a sharp crack. The instructors nodded approvingly. They saw in him the makings of an operative who could slip behind enemy lines and strike hard. But training at Camp X was never limited to technical skill. The instructors knew that a spy's most important tool was the mind. Each evening, the trainees entered a building known informally as the psychological house. There they were subjected to interrogation simulations, stress tests, and memory drills designed to push their limits. In darkened rooms, they faced questions delivered with calculated aggression. They were handcuffed, blindfolded, and ordered to maintain their cover story under pressure. Failure meant repeating the entire course. In these sessions, many discovered the difference between bravery and readiness. A French recruit named Laurent, eager to join resistance operations, was confident on his first night in psychological house. That confidence vanished within minutes as 2 instructors confronted him with rapid, overlapping questions. 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 2 instructors confronted him with rapid, overlapping questions They accused him of lying, of collaborating with the enemy, of hiding details. Sweat formed on his brow. His voice cracked. By the time the session ended, he realized how quickly fear could unravel the most determined man. But he returned the next night stronger, determined to master the techniques that might one day save his life. Language training was another pillar of the program. Trainees destined for European missions practiced accents, local customs, and cultural behaviors. They learned how to forge documents, how to mimic handwriting, and how to alter clothing to match regional fashion. These lessons often took place late at night, long after physical drills had ended. Fatigue became a constant companion, yet the instructors showed no sympathy. They reminded the trainees that missions in occupied lands would offer even less rest. The most advanced trainees were eventually selected for field simulations. These were full-day exercises that unfolded across the surrounding countryside, involving mock enemy patrols, coded messages, and objectives that required teamwork, secrecy, and stamina. In one winter simulation, the trainees were ordered to infiltrate a secured farmhouse guarded by instructors acting as German soldiers. They had to enter undetected, retrieve a set of documents, and escape before dawn. The exercise pushed them to their limits. They moved through snow-covered fields, crawled under fences, and signaled silently with hand gestures. Mercer, now more experienced, led a small group toward the farmhouse's side entrance. They bypassed the guards using a diversion created with a small time device. Inside, they found the chest containing the documents. As they disappeared into the night, Harrison watched from a distance, noting their precision. The trainees had begun to operate like real covert agents. Yet for every success, there were failures. One evening, Jensen mishandled a radio during a timed drill, causing a delay that would have exposed a real mission. The instructor confiscated his notes and sent him back to the first communication module. He spent weeks relearning the basics, determined not to fall behind again. As winter passed and spring thawed the fields, the men changed. They moved with greater confidence, spoke with greater precision, and approached every task with the awareness that their survival depended on their discipline. Camp X reshaped them into instruments of secrecy, capable of slipping through borders, dismantling enemy infrastructure, or gathering intelligence under the noses of occupying forces. By the end of their training cycle, each man faced a final interview. The instructors reviewed their strengths, weaknesses, psychological resilience, and suitability for field operations. Some were assigned to special operations in Europe, others to communications roles supporting missions abroad. A few were quietly redirected to intelligence gathering in North America. Regardless of assignment, none of them offered goodbyes when they left. They simply packed their belongings, stepped into unmarked vehicles, and disappeared from camp. The silence of Camp X was part of its design. The men who trained there would never speak of what they learned, not even decades later. Their missions would remain unacknowledged, their risks unrecognized, their sacrifices unnamed. As the sun set on the final day of one training cycle, the camp fell quiet except for the distant hum of the Hydra transmitters. Harrison stood near the gate, hands clasped behind his back, watching as the departing vehicle disappeared down the dirt road. The men trained here would soon step into the darkest corners of the global conflict. Some would return. Others would never be heard from again. Camp X had forged them in silence. Now the shadow war awaited. In the spring of 1942, the first fully trained operatives left Camp X under identities that did not belong to them. They carried forged documents, memorized routes, and instructions delivered verbally, so nothing could be traced back to the camp on the shore of Lake Ontario. Their departure left no signatures, no official acknowledgement, and no written record. Yet the effect of their work began spreading across occupied Europe only months later, rippling silently through enemy networks. Camp X had begun influencing the war in places where armies could not march and planes could not fly. One of the earliest operatives trained at the camp entered France under the guise of a factory technician. His real name was removed from every document, and the instructors referred to him only by his assigned code name. He slipped into Lyon through neutral territory, carrying knowledge he had practiced for months on Canadian soil. His first mission involved mapping German supply routes and identifying the safest channels for resistance couriers. The reports he transmitted through coded radio bursts made their way across the Atlantic to the Hydra building at Camp X. The signals bounced rapidly through the antennas that rose from the camp, disguised as agricultural structures. Within hours, the intelligence reached London and was incorporated into the planning for future Allied operations. These transmissions marked only the beginning. Hydra soon became one of the most important communication hubs in the Allied world. Operators inside the building worked both day and night, decoding messages from resistance cells, forwarding orders from London, and quietly assisting American intelligence agents who lacked their own wartime infrastructure. Before the Office of Strategic Services fully matured, its early officers relied heavily on Camp X. They traveled to Oshawa under diplomatic cover, met Canadian and British instructors, and learned the techniques they would later develop into American espionage doctrine. One American officer, Colonel Edward K. Miller, visited Camp X in late 1942. He walked the grounds with a serious expression, absorbing the efficiency and discipline embedded in the routines. In Hydra, he watched as Canadian technicians converted coded messages into clean English lines with astonishing speed. Miller later described the experience as a turning point in American intelligence history. The collaboration between Canada, Britain, and the United States formed the foundation of joint operations that continued long after the war ended. Camp X operatives soon began participating in sabotage efforts that struck at the heart of German supply chains. In one notable operation, a pair of agents trained on the camp's woodland demolition range infiltrated a rail network servicing the Atlantic coast. They carried only what they could conceal in their clothing: detonators, compact charges, and tools disguised as everyday items. Under cover of night, they positioned explosives beneath a key junction used to transport munitions. The resulting disruption delayed shipments for weeks. The name of the operation never appeared in newspapers or official communiques. But the intelligence community understood the significance. The agents disappeared back into the landscape, reaching safe houses and eventually re-establishing radio contact with the Allies. Another trainee, Kolar, who had shown exceptional skill with explosives during his time at Camp X, found himself deep inside Czechoslovakia by 1943. His mission involved supporting local resistance groups that lacked the technical knowledge to disable German communication lines. He trained villagers in the same methods he had learned near Lake Ontario, adjusting their techniques to fit the harsh realities of occupation. The results were immediate. German military headquarters reported unexpected disruptions in telegraph lines and road networks. Kolar transmitted updates through short, encrypted bursts. Each message carried pieces of information that London and Ottawa used to adjust their broader strategies. The Shadow War continued to expand. By 1943, the demands placed on Camp X had grown beyond training and communications. The facility became an unofficial meeting ground for intelligence officers navigating the complexities of inter-allied cooperation. Representatives from Britain, Canada, and the United States moved through its gates in unmarked vehicles. They discussed everything from sabotage plans to the logistics of preparing for a massive European invasion. The camp served as a bridge when political tensions surfaced between agencies. Behind closed doors, leaders exchanged intelligence that could not be shared through diplomatic channels. As the conflict intensified, Hydra became even more essential. The building's radio operators processed transmissions from operatives deep within occupied countries who had no other lifeline. In some cases, the signals were faint and fragmented, distorted by distance and interference. Operators listened with practiced patience, waiting for recognizable patterns to emerge. When they identified specific codes, they immediately forwarded the information across secure lines. These moments often meant the difference between life and death for the agents in the field. Hydra also played a key role in deceiving the Axis powers. The Allies developed complex misinformation operations designed to mislead German intelligence. Some of these false signals were crafted at Camp X, sent across networks that appeared authentic to enemy listeners. By feeding the Germans inaccurate reports about troop movements and supply chains, the Allies obscured their real strategies. The full extent of these deception campaigns remained classified for decades, but historians later recognized the significance of Hydra's contributions. While Hydra shaped the intelligence front, the camp's graduates were reshaping the ground war. A small team trained in Canada participated in operations in the Mediterranean, where their skills in infiltration proved critical. Their ability to move across enemy-controlled areas without attracting attention allowed them to secure landing sites, sabotage enemy fuel depots, and coordinate with local fighters. In one instance, an operative led a group through rugged terrain to identify hidden German observation posts. His report, transmitted through coded channels, enabled Allied aircraft to strike the positions before a major offensive. The war in the shadows demanded sacrifices that often went unnoticed. Some Camp X operatives never returned. Their missions ended in capture or death, and because their work was classified, their families received no explanations. Others survived, but were unable to speak publicly about their contributions. They returned home under the same cover identities they had lived under during their missions, carrying memories they were forbidden to share. In the final year of the war, Camp X continued training agents, though the focus shifted as Allied forces gained ground. The need for sabotage diminished slightly, while the demand for intelligence gathering and undercover coordination increased. Trainees practiced how to evaluate abandoned enemy positions, interview liberated civilians, and track down individuals suspected of aiding Axis operations. They learned methods of gathering evidence that would later assist in post-war investigations. As the conflict approached its end, the camp's importance evolved once more. Hydra became a relay point for intelligence related to surrender negotiations, refugee movements, and the collapse of Axis command structures. The operators in the communication building continued their work with the same precision and secrecy, aware that their role was just as vital now as it had been in the darkest months of the war. In the summer of 1945, with Germany defeated and the Pacific War nearing its final chapter, whispers began circulating around Camp X. There were discussions about the future of the facility. Some believed it would expand to support new global intelligence networks. Others believed it would close quietly, its purpose complete. When the war officially ended, the question of Camp X's fate was no longer theoretical. Decisions were made behind closed doors. The buildings remained, but the activity slowed. Eventually, much of the camp was dismantled. Its structures were taken down, its grounds reclaimed by nature. The Hydra building operated for a short while longer before falling silent. The site gradually faded from public awareness as intended. Only decades later did its true significance begin to emerge through declassified files and the memories of aging veterans who had once trained there. Camp X never sought recognition, and the men who trained within its fences rarely received it. Yet their contributions shaped some of the most critical operations of the Second World War. Their transmissions informed Allied strategy. Their sabotage efforts weakened Axis supply lines. Their cooperation laid the foundation for modern North American intelligence. The missions they undertook remained unnamed. Their deeds remained unwritten. But their impact echoed quietly through the Shadow War, altering the course of a global conflict without ever appearing in the headlines.